Next month. Next month's meetup is at Cloudflare near County Hall. It's on the 10th of September, and we have Lydia Halley coming from Sweden or the Netherlands. I'm not quite where she lives. And Tim Verreek of Akamai coming from the Netherlands. So we may be leaving Europe, but we are bringing Europe to you. And tickets are on sale now, so we look forward to seeing you there. If you want to speak, and I know some of you have submitted talk ideas, and Andrew is in the process of getting back to you. If you want to speak, or if you have a mate that you think should speak, feel free to submit a talk. Because, it's all well and good us flying people from Google and Samsung Internet in there, but we want local heroes too. And we all have great stories to tell. Videos. Videos are available of every single talk for about the past 6 years. Sometimes it takes us a bit of a while to get them up there, like it took me 3 weeks to do last month's. But tonight we have Meetup Video who are filming it live streaming it, and the videos will be there as soon as Simon splits them in half. So, the videos are there if you want them, and there's a great number of videos there. We still offer childcare. Nobody has taken us up on childcare since the first new meetup of the series, but we offer childcare. And, if you know somebody who should come along, who needs help with childcare, we will sort them out. We will either do it at the venue, or we will come to another arrangement that allows them to come, because it's really important to us to try and make this as an inclusive meetup as possible. And when you all bought a ticket or had a free ticket, you all signed up to our code of conduct. So code of conduct is not just be nice to people, it is welcome people regardless of whether they like you or not. Embrace different views, embrace different religions, embrace different races, embrace people of different sexuality, Be welcoming to everybody. And if something troubles you, if something makes you uncomfortable, come find me or Simon, who's standing at the back waving, or Andrew, who was printing tickets out, or not address labels, name labels out, and we will resolve the situation. We are still looking for sponsors. We have some sponsors. We're just waiting for their invoices, and then we can put their logos up here, because this meetup isn't free to run. Yes, we have lovely people who give us free venues, but we pay for videos. Not here, but we pay for beer and food and stuff like that. So it costs money. And thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, whose logos will appear here soon, we can give you a great night out. So tonight we actually have 3 speakers. Normally we do 2, but tonight we're lucky. We're going to have Ada from Samsung Internet, who's going to talk about web workers. We have Li Wen of News UK, who's going to talk about their case study, going to talk about their journey on the sun of how they improved web performance. And then we're going to have Yoav, and Yoav is going to kick off. And I've known Yoav a long time. Back when he worked for some little French mobile provider. Somebody providing boxes to French mobile infrastructure that caused chaos for websites. And he's moved on in the world since then. He's been through Akamai, and he's now joined Google. And he's going to talk to us first tonight about user-centered metrics. So please, welcome Yoav.
I'm Rob. I've been working as part of the Google Programs team for the last 10 months. I've been working as part of the Chromium project and on Web Center for the last 7 months. And I've been working on web performance for the last 2 decades almost, if you month. So that means two things. One is that I'm old, but the other is that I have invested. Basically, I invested my whole career on the assumption that faster is better. And I feel pretty good about that because we have a lot of case studies that show that various metrics of user satisfaction and business metrics go along with that, and faster sites get better results. At the same time, after 2 decades, we still don't know to define what is fast. In the early days, we used to have, or we still have, window.onload as the metric that people look at. But its relevance has declined over the years because it doesn't really correlate with the user's experience today. For some websites, window onload fires way too early before anything is on screen. For others, it fires significantly later than when users would consider the site usable. But window.onload has many pros that make it very hard for us to get people to stop using it as the metric. It is simple to define and understand. Just wait until all the site's resources finish loading and then you're done. It's ubiquitous. It's supported in all browsers. And it, most importantly, at least in my view, it doesn't require any extra work from the developer to define what the metric means in order for people to be able to measure it. And we've been telling people that they should move on for the longest while, I would say around 10 years. But we didn't really provide them with a good alternative that has all those qualities, all those benefits. We tried to get people to move on to user timing and define their own custom metrics. But user timing can only measure things that are happening inside JavaScript. And at the same time, it requires a lot of work. And people are not necessarily, the people who are measuring performance are not necessarily the people who will do the work and know the content well enough in order to do the work and define what is the custom metric for each different part of their sites. And on top of that, we've also came to the realization that there is no single metric that will represent the entire user journey. So we need various metrics. We need multiple metrics that will represent meaningful points in the user's journey. And we need them to define, to provide that by default. But at the same time, we need those metrics to be customizable. And we need, for the cases where developers are willing to invest extra work in making the metrics matter more for their site, that needs to be possible. There are also various different categories for our various performance metrics. So traditionally, we focused on onload and DOM content loaded, which are not really related to what the user is experiencing. Both are related to what the browser is experiencing when the page is loaded. But when we look at what the user is experiencing, we have visual metrics on the one hand. So when is the website being rendered on screen? What is the user seeing? We have interactivity metrics. So is the website slow to interact with? If the user clicks on something, is that janky or is that smooth? And then finally, we have user annoyance metrics, for lack of a better term, and we'll talk about that in the end, but it's basically, for right now, focusing on bad patterns that happen during page load. We also have RUM measurements, so real user measurements versus lab. And I'm not going to go into the debate of which one is better because there is no better. RUM is great in order to get real-life results from users in the wild on real-life devices in scenarios you didn't really think of testing and in conditions you didn't think of testing. At the same time, lab testing gives you a very predictable way to recreate and test with predictable conditions your website's performance, which gives you a way to test improvements and gives you a way to test whether you have regressed or improved over time. So starting off by talking about visual metrics. When it comes to lab, we have speed index and visually complete. Both are valid lab metrics. Both try to estimate when everything is rendered as far as the user is concerned. Both suffer from various problems when it comes to websites that continue to change, that infinitely change. So for example, when you have image galleries or pop-ups or splash screens, those are things that impact speed index and visually complete scores, sometimes to a degree that is not justified. But when it comes to RUM metrics, we added a year ago, I believe, first paint and first contentful paint to the list of visual metrics that we didn't have before. So those metrics look at paint operations that the browser is performing and then measure the first ones. So first paint is the point in time where something that is not a blank screen is drawn on the page. But first contentful paint is a bit more complete than that, where contentful is everything that is a non-white, non-white canvas or any kind of text or any kind of image, including background images. And that is the point in time where first contentful paint or FCP is registered. At the same time, it's not necessarily the most meaningful paint that the user is experiencing. This is just film strip screenshot I took this afternoon just on the first random site that I went to, which was Chrome Dev Summit. And we see that first contentful paint here happens, right here it really looks like a blank screen. On laptop you can see that there are some very small gray gradients, but at the same time, from a user's perspective, it's indistinguishable from a blank screen, and even if it wasn't, it's not necessarily something that the user can do anything with. And we also have the first meaningful paint metric as part of Lighthouse, but that was never standardized and never attempted to bring it over to other browsers and other rendering engines out beyond Chromium and Blink, because it's very much based on Blink implementation details and various heuristics that are hard to reason about. So it's still a metric as part of Lighthouse, but it's not something that we're trying to standardize and bring over to be a web-based metric, a RUM metric. And the replacement for that, or the next generation of that effort, is largest contentful paint. Where contentful here mean very much, it's very similar to the definitions that are part of the first contentful paint. But here we're trying to capture the largest one, basically relying on the assumption that the largest paint operation or the largest element on the page is likely to be, even if not the most meaningful one of the most meaningful ones. So the impacted elements similar to FCP are HTML images, background images, various text blocks. And as part of the entry, you can see either the render time for either the text or the image, or the load time in cases where we cannot really expose the render time due to lack of CORS permissions for cross-origin images, as well as the size, the area of the image, the element's ID, the URL if it's an image, and a link to the element itself in case the element is still attached to the DOM. And each entry that is emitted by the browser is the largest entry so far because the browser cannot really predict the future and cannot know ahead of time what would be the largest one. So as developers, you are probably interested in the latest one, or at the same time, you can look at all the different, looking at all the different largest elements throughout the page loading gives you some sense of the journey, gives you a way to recreate some sort of a film strip. Simon, if you can get on something that visualizes a film strip from RUM based on all the largest entries so far, that would be awesome by the end of the evening, if possible.
Done.
Cool. And then we talked about the metrics customizability. So the assumption that largest is the most meaningful one is not always the right assumption. And for that, we have element timing. So whenever developers are interested in making that metric more precise or getting more measurements from their page regarding other elements that are not necessarily the largest, they can add a markup attribute of element timing to either basically any random element that is rendered. I mean, adding that to a script won't make a lot of sense, but any block level element or even inline one, I think, will work. And yeah, for images it works. So that would give you very similar entries for that specific element that also include everything we talked about before, but also the identifier, which is the value of the element timing attribute. So you can know which element that was without having to necessarily look at the element node itself. So that, if you're interested in measuring visual metrics and visual metrics of your site loading, that should give you, between LCP, which is there by default, and element timing, which is there if you want it, if you want to make it more precise, that should give you more or less a complete picture. And yeah, I don't have a slide for that, but basically as far as browser support right now, so LCP is just, as well as element timing, are just shipping in Chrome 77. So the next version that will make it into stable, it's now in Chrome beta, where First Paint and First Contentful Paint have been shipping for a while in Chrome, but not yet in other rendering engines. Okay, interactivity metrics. Who here is familiar with TTI or time to interactive? Who here likes TTI? Hey, Simon, and yeah, sure. Thank you. But most people don't really get TTI and don't necessarily agree with the fact that it represents the user's experience. And It's very hard to argue with that. TTI has many arbitrary values. You have to wait for a period of time of the browser being idle before retroactively declaring that TTI happened before that. And it's essentially a lab metric because it's hard to reason about TTI for pages that actually get interacted with. When it comes to RUM, we have long tasks that are the underlying primitive behind TTI. So they enable interested folks to calculate TTI as part of a RUM metric, and they generally enable people to know when the browser's main thread was fully occupied, or fully occupied for a long period of time, where long is defined as anything over 50 milliseconds. So they can enable you to know when the main thread was pinned down and wasn't able to handle anything else, including user interaction. And those are the points in time where if the user has interacted with the page, they would get frustrated, the page wouldn't have responded to them as they would like. One big component that is missing from current long tasks is attribution. So you can know when those points in time happened, but you can't really do anything about it because you don't know which part of your script or your multiple scripts, potentially coming from multiple different vendors and hosts, was responsible for that particular long task. So it's very hard to very hard to do the forensics work to track down blame for long tasks today. But this is something that we've heard from the web performance community as part of the web performance working group, and is probably something that we should improve, hopefully soon. But as an improvement to long tasks, or as sugar on top of long tasks, we now equally shipping first input delay, not yet event timing. Event timing is coming soon. But those are event performance entries that represent the time it took for an event to be processed. So for first input delay, all first input events will be reported as an entry, assuming that it is observed. So you can know for your users whether their first interaction with the page was a positive one or a negative one. And for other event timing entries, they will only be reported if the event took longer than a certain threshold, which is, again, I believe 52 milliseconds, because it needed to be fuzzed to some extent. But it's, in the median, it shouldn't take more than, substantially more than 50 milliseconds for users to handle, for the browser to handle user events. And in case it did, this will be reported, and each one of these entries can be considered as, okay, this was a bad user experience, and it's something that we need to tackle. And as far as attribution goes, we will still probably need to rely on long task attribution to be fixed in order to know which long task resulted in the event being long, or we would also potentially, we'll need to figure out attribution for event timing. This is not part of the currently shipping solution, but it will be potentially in the future. And as for TTI, despite the fact that Simon and Andrew like it, there are many people who feel that it is not a sufficient lab metric in order to measure interactivity issues. So there's a new metric in the works called total blocking time, which is the sum of all queuing times that are longer than 50 milliseconds. And various tests have shown that it gives a better, it correlates better with actual interactivity problems as well as sites that don't really have interactivity problems compared to TTI. And you can also implement it yourself with long tasks by just summing up the duration of all of them while deducing the 50 milliseconds at start. And finally, user annoyance. That's the final and relatively new category that we're considering. And in order to explain, can you click the video thing? So just so this is the problem.